La Agencia Internacional de la Energía publica durante cada semana informes para arrojar luz sobre este contexto eléctrico, energético en todo el mundo. Uno de los últimos informes se ha conocido en las últimas jornadas y vamos a hablar con uno de sus autores para conocer en qué momento estamos exactamente, si hay o no riesgo energético, si hay problemas que hay que atender de manera inmediata en el contexto europeo y también en países como España. Nos acompaña Stefan Lorenczik, analista de energía y electricidad de la Agencia Internacional de la Energía. Stefan, good afternoon. Thank you for being here in Negocios Televisión.
Thank you for inviting me.
The report that you published last week says something like the step increase in demand outstripped the ability of sources of electricity supply in the last year. Countries like China and India suffered from power cuts in the second half of the year because of coal shortages. What can we expect for the coming months?
You're right. We had a strong increase in electricity demand, especially also in China and India, where electricity demand grew by more than 10% in both countries. And as a consequence of that, and we had some supply issues, we had power cuts in September and October 2021. This mainly affected industrial consumers, but from time to time also households. But towards the end of the year, the supply constraints have eased and relieved. So at the moment, the situation is much better again. The stocks at the power plants are filling up again. So overall, the situation looks quite good. So we won't probably see these shortcuts again in China and India in the upcoming winter.
Mm-hmm. Sharp spikes in electricity prices in recent times have been causing hardship for many households and businesses around the world and risk becoming a driver of social and political tensions. In what way? What should policymakers do to solve it?
Yeah, you're right. Electricity prices, most of all the wholesale prices, have increased significantly in the second half of 2021. And this is mostly due to the increase in gas prices. And as in Europe, typically gas-fired power plants are the price-setting technology. The wholesale prices followed the gas price. This hasn't fully manifested itself in household and business prices yet, as usually we have some delay until retailers adjust to the increasing wholesale prices, but we expect that to happen more and more in the future. We saw that already in some countries. And this could be, of course, especially for vulnerable customers, be a big burden. And we would advise governments to, especially for these vulnerable customers, to put some support schemes in place. We've seen that already in some countries in Europe. For example, in Spain, we have seen that there were tax cuts. We have in other countries where we have upper price caps on prices. We have sometimes vouchers that are given out to people, and we think this is in general a good idea, given the time of very high prices at the moment.
So, like you've said before, there is a context of high prices, and your price index for major wholesale electricity markets almost doubled compared with 2020, and was up 64% from the last 4 years. So, the European Commission is focusing right now in renewable energy, but electricity from renewable sources only increased by 6% last year. Is this an erroneous point of view? What do you think about it?
I think it's important to clearly say that this is not an issue of renewable energies. This is definitely a problem of high gas prices at the moment. Gas prices, as I said before, have increased significantly, and therefore we have the high prices. So it's not related to renewables. Renewables are doing quite the opposite. So they are providing especially at the moment, very cost-efficient electricity, and they can be also for the future be an option to mitigate the risk of having to import fossil fuels, to having to import gas, and having from time to time these price shocks. So it's quite the opposite. Having more renewables, sourcing energy domestically, it's a good idea to avoid these kind of high price spikes in the future.
And how do you see the recent debate on whether the European Commission should include nuclear and natural gas as green energy?
Definitely, we as the IEA think that nuclear is a valuable source for countries who want to use it. It's a source of low-carbon electricity generation, and it has in the past helped to avoid CO2 emissions to a significant extent. We produced a study in 2019 where we looked at nuclear power and clean energy systems. And there we had a look especially also at advanced economies, and especially then in Europe. And we saw that in order to be able to kind of follow a path that's compatible with the Paris Agreement, many countries, or we have to use all available sources that are available to actually follow that path. And we see in Europe that many nuclear power plants are reaching an age that's kind of the end of their design technical lifetime, and now a lot of money has to be taken in the hands to kind of do maintenance investments and life extension investments. And we think this is this is especially for these existing nuclear plants that are hard to replace in the short term. For example, with renewables, for these it's a very good idea to extend the lifetime to kind of follow a more less carbon intensive path. Regarding gas, for those countries who are now phasing out coal, for example, we have Germany that's phasing out a lot of coal, also reducing the capacity in nuclear, will at the end of this year have completely phased out nuclear. There's a need for having some replacement, at least in the medium term, until we have significant or sufficient capacities of renewable energies. So we think that gas power plants are a good option to provide this secure backup capacity. But of course, this is not a long-term solution. In the long term, we then have to switch to more carbon neutral options. But for the medium term, this is something that will be necessary.
Given this context and looking through the medium or long term, there are some voices now saying that zero emissions are impossible to reach. What do you think about it? Will we reach our 2050 target?
This really depends on policy measures that are taken in the next years. So we are at a point where we see that current commitments to, for example, phasing out coal are not enough to reach their targets, but there's still some time, but we really need to act now to follow a path that would allow us to get to a net zero system by 2050. The IEA has published a study in the previous year, Net Zero by 2050, in which it details paths or potential path to reaching the net zero target to 2050. And we see, unfortunately, not that this path is currently being followed. In our study, we see that for the electricity market, we had an increase of CO2 emissions by 7% in the previous year. This is a new all-time high. And given the current market conditions, the current expected developments, this high level of emissions will sustain for the next years as well until 2024. That's the forecast period of our study. But this, of course, is not where we want to go. We want to reduce emissions. We want to increase significantly investments in renewable energies and alternative electricity production sources to go back or to reach actually a path that can lead us to 2050 with zero emissions.
We want to reduce emissions, we all agree on that, but going back to that debate that we talked earlier, the France position, the German position, what do you think? Do you see a certain pulse to lead the energy race in Europe these days?
I think Europe, of course, is a very advanced economy, and it has special, related resources to follow a more carbon neutral path. But I don't see Europe really at the forefront and overachieving its targets. We see that in several European countries we have challenges ahead to reach the targets for decarbonization, the targets that are agreed in the Paris Agreement. So there's a lot to do also in Europe to reduce emissions domestically. But at the same time, of course, we think that reaching a net zero path by 2050 is something where governments have to work together. They have to cooperate not only on a European level, but also on an international level to find a most effective, most efficient way of reaching net zero emissions. And for that, a cooperation between countries is very necessary. Like rich European countries in Europe, they have the resources, but for example, developing countries, they may not have the resources to reach net zero emissions by themselves in a reasonable time frame. So I think that having international corporations supporting other countries is essential to reaching our targets.
We've talked about gas as well before, and taking into account the gas situation, the Russia situation, and all the recent developments between Russia and the European Union, Ukraine context, how do you see, energetically speaking, Europe? Should we be worried about all of these other factors?
I definitely think that Europe is not in a very comfortable situation at the moment. So we have these very high gas prices that also then triggered the high electricity prices. When we look at gas suppliers, there are some indications that some suppliers could do more, but they are not supported or not supplying Europe to the full extent that is possible. And being then reliant on imports is not very comfortable for Europe. So I think this is really illustrating another time the chances we have with renewable energies. The more we are able to produce electricity domestically and we are less reliant on energy imports from other countries, the more stable our own energy system is, and the more resilient it is also to external shocks like we see at the moment, where we don't have sufficient gas imports and as a consequence very high prices. Related to what the coming months might bring, that's also quite dependent on the weather situation. We have a lot of gas that is also used for heating. Around 40% of electricity that's being imported is used for heating, for household heating. And depending on how the weather will develop in the next, say, 2 months, February and March, this will also then obviously influence the shortage. At the moment, long-term weather forecasts see that we might have a February and March that will not be too cold, so that looks good. But certainly we have to continue monitoring the situation to make sure we won't run into like power cuts in Europe.
Okay, so let's look at the next few months. Stefan Lorenczik, thank you so much for being here.
Inviting me.